Think about the word modernism. Modernism. We often discuss modernism as if it were a thing in itself, but the suffix ism has two functions. To designate its reference as a practice, this is how ism is used in words like criticism or feminism, and to designate it as a property of its referent. That is how ism functions in words like classicism. Conceiving of modernism as a property of buildings is different from conceiving of it as a practice of designers. If we think of modernism as a property of buildings like classicism, the locus of its meaning resides in its objects. If we instead think of modernism as a practice of the people who design buildings, the locus of modernism's meaning lies less in its objects and their design and more in the pattern of actions in which its designers engage. That pattern of actions looks like this. The practitioner begins with the fundamentals of architecture, thresholds, rooms, windows, axes. From there, she or he asks, how can I best make this building suit the social aspirations and realities of its actually existing inhabitants? The curators of the Venice Biennale have asked that we, contemporary practitioners in a globalized world, take the historical period 1914 to 2014 as a baseline for examining architecture's changing relationship to landscape, local cultures, and place. Because those years mainly coincide with what we know as modernism, the question of what modernism is it a property of building objects? Is it a practice, a set of action patterns common to the people who designed them? Is important, not just philosophically, but practically. How we conceive of the notable architecture made in that period, a good deal of which we would call modernist, will structure the framework we use for understanding contemporary buildings and their architects, and how they relate to local cultures, social practices, and places. Has there been a watershed change? A development? To quote Gauguin from his most famous painting, who are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? Conceiving of modernism as a property of objects has deep historical roots. Early proponents of the new architecture believed that it would supersede neoclassicism and other popular styles of the 19th century because it better accommodated the conditions and exigencies of contemporary life. According to their logic, the 20th century would give us modernism just as the 19th century gave us neoclassicism. That implied that modernism, like neoclassicism, was an easily identifiable set of design tropes configured into a style. A style's power resides in its imageability. Say the word modernism, and certain aesthetic moves come to mind. Flat roofs, open plans, new materials, unornamented forms. From 1914 through the 1960s, critics and practitioners proposed that this congregation of formal tropes equaled modernism. Modernism was understood to be a property of buildings. It was a style. But then critics and architects began to identify all sorts of buildings designed in this style by architects such as Giuseppe Torragni and Rob Mallet-Stevens, whose architects made convincing cases that their formal language represented not a radical break from previous eras, but rather a continuity. Better-known practitioners such as Le Corbusier and Mies also made this case, but their examples are complicated. At the same time, others were pointing out that all sorts of card-carrying modernists failed to live by its putative stylistic rules. Gerard Rietveld, architect of the celebrated Schroeder-Schrader house in Utrecht, designed a patently nostalgic country house with load-bearing walls and a thatched, pitched roof. And still other practitioners, architects who were indisputably oriented toward modernism like Alvar Aalto and Hans Scharoun, further confounded a stylistic definition of modernism by exploring pattern and ornament. By mixing traditional materials with reinforced concrete and steel, by abutting load-bearing walls with windows poked through them with transparent window walls. Such inconsistencies provoked people to wonder whether or not modernism could ever have been the characteristic set of formal tropes that one thinks of as a style. In other words, whether modernism was indeed a property of objects. Perhaps modernism never was a style at all, but a practice, a set of patterned actions in which individual designers engaged when designing buildings, actions they believed would help make their buildings modern, in the best sense of the term, better suited to the social life of its inhabitants in this actually existing world. Who are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? What was modernism's relationship to local cultures in place? The answer differs depending upon whether you think of modernism as a property of an object or a practice of designers. If the former, then modernism's objects were united by a formal language they shared, no matter where they were sited or who designed them. Architects might or might not have inflected their designs to suit local circumstances and social practices, but doing so was ancillary to a building's central meaning. Any monkey could identify a modernist building. But if modernism was a practice, the practice of making an object suited especially to contemporary life, then the question of how to make something modern would change over time and space. It would change because it would fundamentally depend upon the configuration of the local cultures, geographic conditions, political and economic circumstances, and social practices in and for which a building was designed. Modernist buildings could look different and be modern, depending upon where and when and by whom and how they were made. And that is what we have found. Modernism is the practice of designing a building suited to modern life, as it presents itself in each given building's program, site, and materials and cultural heritage. Modernism, the practice, is always situated in place, time, culture, and society. A situated modernism is far less imageable than a modernism of flat roofs, but it better accounts for the realities on the ground. Who are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? The Venice Biennale curators wonder if globalization has produced a kind of flattening of the world and of the aesthetic of architecture. Such a proposition is deeply seductive. It expresses a deep-seated angst about the contemporary world, about its fast pace, about what is lost as peoples, societies, and cultures become increasingly interconnected and interdependent. It instantiates the fear that all this vibrant interconnectedness will result in a stultifying homogenization, the homogenization of forms, buildings, cultures, people. But that's not what we see when we look at actually existing buildings on the ground. What we see is not some progressive homogenization that will lead someday to a dystopic endpoint of worldwide sameness, but an ongoing practice of modernism, a situated modernism, whereby architects are trying in an ever-widening circle of circumstances to make their work relevant to the world in which we all live. Today, a large part of what this means is finding a good balance or even the right balance in the ever-shifting landscape of local and global cultures. That balance looks different whether one is designing an enormous mixed-use building complex on the waterfront in Rotterdam, or a small art museum in northern Portugal, a shopping complex in Shanghai, or a gondola-like public transportation system for the favelas in Sao Paulo, a green residential tower in Bangkok, an elementary school in Burkina Faso. And it will look different again in the highly internationalized and very specific site and circumstances of the Venice Biennale. There's not one answer to the question, who are we, where have we been, and where are we going? There are many answers. Answers in the form of situated practices, which result in modest art centers and green residential towers and outrageous opera houses and everything in between, all trying to find their place in the world.